The morning sunlight streamed through the kitchen window as Elena finished packing a lunch for her husband. She hummed softly while carefully wrapping the homemade sandwich in wax paper, turkey with avocado, Thomas's favorite. Elena glanced at the clock hanging on the wall. It was almost 7. Thomas would be heading to the airport soon for his business trip. "Do you have everything you need?" she called out, placing the packed lunch into a brown paper bag. Thomas walked into the kitchen, still adjusting his watch. Despite having enough money to buy any timepiece in the world, he wore the same stainless steel watch Elena had given him for their 5th anniversary. It wasn't expensive, but it meant something to him. "I think so," he replied, running a hand through his slightly graying hair. "It's just a 3-day trip. I should be back Sunday evening." Elena handed him the lunch bag. Anyone who saw them would never guess that Thomas was worth billions. His button-down shirt was neat but not designer. His slacks were from a department store. The only hint of wealth was the quality of his shoes. Thomas always said good shoes were worth the investment for someone who spent most days on their feet. "The kids in my class made you a safe travels card," Elena said, pulling a colorful construction paper creation from her purse. 22 kindergartners had signed their names in wobbly letters across the paper. "They're still convinced you're a superhero in disguise." Thomas laughed, carefully tucking the card into his carry-on bag. "If only they knew I just sit in boring meetings all day." The truth was a bit more complicated. Thomas had started a data security company in their garage 15 years ago. The timing had been perfect, just as businesses were realizing how valuable their digital information was. Now his company protected data for some of the biggest corporations in the world, but they never flaunted the money. They lived in the same neighborhood where Elena had grown up, in a house that was nice but not showy. Thomas drove a 5-year-old car. Elena still taught kindergarten at the local elementary school, a job she'd had since before they met. "Promise you'll eat something, besides airport food?" Elena asked, straightening his collar. "I promise." Thomas leaned down to kiss her goodbye. "What are your plans while I'm gone?" Elena shrugged. "The usual. School, then grading papers. Lisa invited me to her book club on Saturday, but I'm not sure I'll go." Lisa was one of the few people who knew about their financial situation. She'd been Elena's friend since college, long before Thomas's success. Most of their neighbors and even Elena's co-workers had no idea. "You should go," Thomas encouraged. "You've been working too hard lately." It was true. The school year was winding down, which meant progress reports, parent meetings, and preparing the kids for first grade. Elena loved her job, but May was always exhausting. "Maybe," Elena said. "We'll see how I feel." After Thomas left, Elena finished getting ready for her day. She chose a simple blouse and comfortable slacks, perfect for a day spent mostly on the floor with 5-year-olds. Her only jewelry was her wedding ring and a pair of small pearl earrings that had belonged to her grandmother. The school day passed in a blur of alphabet songs, counting practice, and mediating tiny disagreements. By Friday afternoon, Elena felt the week's weight on her shoulders. The classroom was finally quiet after the last child had been picked up. Elena sat at her small desk, surrounded by artwork and half-finished science projects. Her phone buzzed with a text from Thomas. "Meeting. Finished early. Miss you. How was your week?" Elena smiled, typing back. "Exhausting but good. Miss you too." She looked around at the empty classroom and made a sudden decision. Instead of microwaving leftovers at home alone, she would treat herself to a nice dinner out. Something to celebrate making it through the week. There was a new restaurant everyone in town had been talking about, Luminescence. It had opened about 2 months ago and quickly became the place to be seen. Elena had heard other teachers discussing it in the break room, marveling at the chef who had apparently worked in Paris. On impulse, Elena pulled up the restaurant's website on her phone. They had a last-minute cancellation for 7:30 that evening. Before she could second-guess herself, she booked it. At home, Elena stood in front of her closet considering her options. She didn't own many fancy clothes, but there was a navy blue dress she'd bought for a school fundraiser last year. It wasn't designer, but it was elegant in its simplicity. She paired it with low heels and a small handbag. Her hair, usually pulled, back in a practical ponytail for teaching, she wore down, the dark waves falling past her shoulders. The restaurant was downtown, an area that had been revitalized in recent years with boutiques and galleries. Elena found a parking spot a block away and walked to the entrance where warm golden light spilled onto the sidewalk. Through the windows, she could see tables of well-dressed people, crystal glasses catching the light from overhead chandeliers. For a moment Elena hesitated. The people inside looked so polished, so confident. She felt a familiar twinge of self-consciousness, the feeling that had followed her from childhood when her clothes came from thrift stores, while her classmates wore the latest styles. "Don't be silly," she murmured to herself. "You have a reservation like everyone else." Taking a deep breath, Elena pushed open the heavy glass door. The interior was even more impressive up close. The ceiling soared overhead, with modern art installations hanging from exposed beams. The walls were painted a deep charcoal, making the brass fixtures and tables stand out in contrast. A tall man in a perfectly tailored suit stood behind a sleek podium, his expression carefully neutral as he greeted guests. Elena approached, adjusting her handbag nervously. "Good evening," she said with a smile. "I have a reservation for one. Elena Rodriguez for 7:30. The maitre d' ran his finger down a tablet screen, his expression unchanging. "Rodriguez," he repeated, dragging out the syllables as if tasting them. His eyes flicked up, taking in her appearance with a quick sweep. Something in his gaze made Elena want to check if she had a stain on her dress. "Yes, I see it here." His tone was clipped. "However, we're running slightly behind this evening. If you'd like to wait at the bar, we'll call you when your table is ready." Elena nodded, trying not to show her disappointment. "Of course, thank you." The bar area was crowded with people holding cocktails in elegant glasses. Elena found a small space at the corner of the bar and ordered a glass of white wine. As she waited, she watched the restaurant operate with fascination. Servers moved between tables with choreographed precision. Food arrived under silver domes, revealed with theatrical flourishes. Time ticked by. Elena nursed her wine, watching as other patrons arrived after her but were seated immediately. Most wore clothes that even Elena, who paid little attention to fashion, could tell were expensive. The women carried handbags that probably cost more than her monthly salary. The men wore watches that caught the light with platinum and gold. After 45 minutes, Elena approached the podium again. The maitre d' was speaking to a couple who had just arrived, the woman draped in a dress that seemed to be made of liquid silver, the man in a suit that screamed custom-made. "James, darling," the woman said to the maitre d'. "Lovely to see you again." "Mrs. Chen, Mr. Chen, always a pleasure," he replied with genuine warmth. "Your usual table is ready." Elena waited patiently until they were led away. The maitre d' turned to her, his smile fading. "Yes?" he asked, as if he'd never seen her before. "I've been waiting almost an hour for my table," Elena said politely. "I was wondering if there's been some mix-up with my reservation." The maitre d' consulted his tablet again, making a show of scrolling through information. "Rodriguez, yes, I'm afraid we're still quite backed up this evening. Perhaps another 15 minutes. Elena glanced around the restaurant. Several tables sat empty, their surfaces gleaming under the warm lighting. Before she could point this out, a new voice entered the conversation. "Is there a problem, James?" A man appeared beside the maitre d', his suit even more immaculate, his posture radiating authority. A small pin on his lapel identified him as the manager. "No problem, sir," the maitre d' replied. "This lady is waiting for a table." The manager's eyes swept over Elena in the same dismissive way. Something hardened in his expression. "I see," he said coolly. "I apologize, ma'am, but we're experiencing unusual delays tonight. Perhaps," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "perhaps you would be more comfortable at one of the casual dining establishments down the street. I hear the Italian place has a lovely early bird special." The meaning was unmistakable. Elena felt heat rise to her cheeks as several nearby guests turned to watch the exchange. In that moment, she wasn't a 38-year-old teacher with a master's degree and 15 years of experience shaping young minds. She wasn't the wife of a man whose technological innovations had changed the industry. She was just a woman, in a non-designer dress who didn't belong. "I understand," Elena said quietly, gathering her dignity around her like armor. "Thank you for your time." She turned and walked out, head held high despite the burning humiliation. In the cool evening air, she took a deep breath, fighting back tears. It had been a long time since someone had made her feel so small, so invisible. What Elena didn't know was that this slight would set in motion events that would change not just Luminescence, but the entire way the restaurant chain did business. Because while Elena might look like a simple kindergarten teacher in a department store dress, her husband was anything but simple. And when Thomas Whitmore returned from his business trip, the people who had dismissed his wife would learn a powerful lesson about judging books by their covers. Elena's car was quiet as she drove, home from Luminescence. The only sound the occasional sniffle she couldn't quite hold back. Streetlights flashed across her face, illuminating the traces of tears she kept wiping away. "This is silly," she told herself, gripping the steering wheel tighter. "You're a grown woman crying over not getting a table at a restaurant." But it wasn't just about the table. It was about the way they had looked at her, sized her up, and found her lacking. It was about standing in a room full of people and feeling completely invisible. When Elena arrived home, the house was dark and empty. Usually she enjoyed the peaceful solitude when Thomas was away on business, but tonight the quiet rooms only amplified her loneliness. She kicked off her shoes by the door and hung her purse on the hook, habits from 15 years of marriage. In the kitchen, Elena opened the refrigerator and stared at the contents without really seeing them. Her appetite was gone. Instead, she poured herself a glass of water and carried it to the living room, where she curled up on the couch with a blanket. Her phone buzzed with a text from Thomas. "About to board my flight home. See you tomorrow morning. Love you." Elena smiled despite her mood. She typed back, "Safe travels. Love you too." Her finger hovered over the screen, tempted to tell him about what had happened at the restaurant. But what would be the point? It would only upset him, and there was nothing he could do about it now. Some part of her also felt embarrassed, as if the rejection at Luminescence had somehow been her fault. Instead, she put on an old movie and tried to lose herself in the familiar story. Eventually, she dozed off on the couch, still wearing her blue dress from the evening's disaster. Elena woke to sunlight streaming through the windows and the sound of keys in the front door. Disoriented, she sat up quickly, realizing she had spent the entire night on the couch. "Elena?" Thomas called out as he entered, setting down his suitcase by the door. "In here," she replied, running her fingers through her tangled hair. Thomas appeared in the doorway, his face breaking into a smile at the sight of her. Then his expression changed to concern. "Did you sleep out here?" he asked, walking over to sit beside her. "And is that what you wore yesterday?" Elena looked down at her wrinkled dress and laughed self-consciously. "I guess I fell asleep watching a movie." Thomas studied her face carefully. After 15 years together, he could read her like no one else. "What's wrong? Your eyes are puffy." "It's nothing," Elena said automatically. "How was your trip?" "Elena." Thomas took her hand gently. "Talk to me. Did something happen while I was gone?" The genuine worry in his eyes broke through her resolve. Elena sighed, pulling the blanket tighter around herself. "I tried to go to that new restaurant everyone's been talking about. Luminescence." "By yourself?" Thomas asked, sounding surprised but not disapproving. Elena nodded. "I had a reservation and everything, but when I got there..." She trailed off, the humiliation washing over her again. "What happened?" Thomas prompted quietly. "They wouldn't seat me," Elena admitted. "Well, not exactly. They made me wait at the bar for over an hour while they seated other people who came in after me, and then the manager suggested I might be more comfortable at the casual place down the street." She mimicked the manager's condescending tone. Thomas's expression darkened. "They turned you away." Not in so many words, but it was pretty clear. I didn't fit their image. Elena gestured at herself. I wasn't wearing designer clothes, I didn't have the right look. That's discrimination, Thomas said, his voice tight with anger. They can't do that. Elena shrugged. They didn't say it. It was because I wasn't fancy enough. They just kept making excuses about delays, while seating other people right in front of you, Thomas finished. He stood up abruptly, pacing the living room. This is unacceptable, I'm going to call them. No, please don't, Elena said quickly. It's embarrassing enough as it is, I don't want to make a scene. It's not about making a scene, Thomas argued. It's about basic respect. They can't treat people like that. Let's just forget about it, Elena pleaded. It's just one restaurant. There are plenty of others. Thomas sat back down beside her, taking both her hands in his. Elena, look at me. You've spent your entire life letting things slide, accepting less than you deserve because you don't want to make waves. It's one of the things I love about you. Your humility. But sometimes standing up for yourself isn't making a scene. It's simply demanding the basic respect every person deserves. Elena looked into his eyes, seeing the fierce protectiveness there. It was a side of Thomas few people ever saw. The determination that had built his company from nothing. The quiet strength that never backed down from a challenge. What would you even say to them? She asked. I don't know yet, Thomas admitted. But I do know that I'm not letting this go. The next morning, Elena woke to find Thomas's side of the bed empty. She followed the sound of his voice to his home office where he was on the phone, speaking in the calm, measured tone he used for important business matters. Yes, I understand, he was saying. And you're certain about this? Good. I'll have my team send over the paperwork this afternoon. When he hung up, Elena leaned against the doorframe. Everything okay? Thomas looked up with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Just taking care of some business that came up during my trip. Elena knew him well enough to sense there was more to it, but she didn't press. Thomas had always handled his business affairs with minimal discussion at home, not wanting to bore her with the details of corporate acquisitions and technology patents. Over breakfast, Thomas asked casually, "Do you have plans for tonight?" Elena shook her head. Not really. Why? I thought we could go out to dinner, Thomas suggested. Somewhere nice. A knot formed in Elena's stomach. I'm not really in the mood for fancy restaurants right now. Trust me, Thomas said, reaching across the table to squeeze her hand. Please. There was something in his expression, a mixture of determination and excitement, that made Elena curious despite her reluctance. All right, she agreed. But nothing too elaborate. Thomas smiled. Wear whatever makes you comfortable. That evening, Elena chose a simple black dress and flat shoes. She applied minimal makeup and pulled her hair into a neat ponytail. Thomas wore what he always wore for dinner out, khaki pants and a button-down shirt. They could have been any middle-class couple heading out for a Saturday night meal. As Thomas drove through town, Elena gazed out the window, enjoying the familiar sights of their community. When he turned onto the street leading downtown, a sudden suspicion made her turn to him. Thomas, she said slowly, where are we going? His eyes remained fixed on the road. You'll see. When he pulled into a parking space just a block from Luminescence, Elena's suspicion turned to certainty. No, she said firmly. Absolutely not. I am not going back there. Thomas turned off the engine and shifted to face her. Elena, do you trust me? That's not fair, she protested. It's a simple question, he persisted gently. Do you trust me? Elena sighed. Of course I do. But this isn't about trust, it's about walking back into a place where I was humiliated. I would never put you in that position again, Thomas promised. Please, give me 30 minutes. If you're uncomfortable at any point, we'll leave immediately. Elena looked into his eyes, seeing the sincerity there. After 15 years, she had never known Thomas to break a promise. 30 minutes, she agreed reluctantly. They walked together toward the restaurant. Thomas's hand warm and reassuring against her lower back. The same golden light spilled onto the sidewalk from Luminescence's windows. The same well-dressed crowd milled about near the entrance. Elena's steps slowed as they approached the door. "I can't." "You can," Thomas said quietly. "Remember, you have as much right to be here as anyone else. More, actually." Before Elena could ask what he meant by that, Thomas had opened the door, ushering her into the elegant interior. The restaurant was even more crowded than it had been the night before, buzzing with weekend energy. The same maitre d' stood at his podium, tablet in hand. When they approached, his eyes swept over them with the same dismissive glance Elena remembered all too well. "Good evening," Thomas said pleasantly. "Reservation for Whitmore." The maitre d' tapped at his screen, his expression bored. "Whitmore? Ah, yes, I see it here." He glanced up, taking in their casual attire. "I'm afraid we're experiencing quite a delay this evening. Perhaps you'd like to wait at the bar? It might be." He paused, eyeing Elena with faint recognition. "Quite some time." Thomas smiled, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I don't think that will be necessary, James." The maitre d' blinked in surprise at the use of his name. "I'm sorry, have we—" He was interrupted by a commotion from the back of the restaurant. A man in an expensive suit was hurrying toward them, his face pale. It was the manager who had suggested Elena try the casual place down the street the night before. "Mr. Whitmore," the manager said breathlessly, "we've been expecting you. Your table is ready right away. Please follow me." James, the maitre d', looked between the manager and Thomas with open confusion. "Sir, It's all right, James." The manager cut him off, his voice tight. "Mr. Whitmore and his wife are our special guests tonight." As they followed the manager to a prime table in the center of the restaurant, Elena leaned close to Thomas and whispered, "What's going on?" Thomas merely squeezed her hand, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Wait and see." And as they were seated with elaborate courtesy, Elena couldn't help but notice that every staff member in the restaurant was watching them with a mixture of curiosity and what looked suspiciously like fear. Something had changed since last night, and Elena had the distinct feeling that her humble husband was at the center of that change. The manager himself pulled out Elena's chair, a gesture that made her cheeks flush with awkwardness. Last night, this same man had practically told her to leave. Now he was hovering around their table like they were royalty. "Our chef has prepared several special items tonight," he said, his voice overly cheerful. "Not on the menu. He would be honored to create a customized tasting experience for you both." Thomas nodded politely. "That sounds fine. And of course your meal this evening is completely complimentary," the manager added quickly. "That won't be necessary," Thomas replied, his tone pleasant but firm. "We're happy to pay just like any other customer." The manager looked like he wanted to argue but thought better of it. "Of course, sir. Would you like to see our wine list?" "Just water for now, thank you," Thomas said. As the manager hurried away, Elena leaned across the table. "Thomas, what's going on?" she whispered. "Why is everyone acting so strange?" Thomas took a sip of the water a server had hastily poured. "I may have made a few phone calls after you told me what happened." Elena narrowed her eyes. "What kind of phone calls?" Before Thomas could answer, a server approached with a basket of fresh bread and a small plate of what looked like olive oil sprinkled with herbs. "Compliments of the chef," he said with a nervous smile. Elena waited until the server had walked away before fixing Thomas with a look that had made generations of kindergartners confess to stolen cookies. "Thomas, what did you do?" Thomas broke off a piece of bread and dipped it in the oil. "Remember that real estate investment group I told you about? The one looking for commercial properties downtown?" Elena nodded slowly. "The one your friend Raj started?" "That's the one." Thomas chewed thoughtfully. "It turns out that this restaurant space was on their list of potential acquisitions. The whole building, actually." Elena's eyes widened. "Thomas, you didn't—" Thomas shrugged, looking almost sheepish. "I made a call to Raj this morning. Told him I was personally interested in this property." "You bought the building?" Elena whispered, her voice rising slightly. Just because they were rude to me? Not exactly, Thomas replied. I simply became the majority investor in the company that owns not just this building, but the entire luminescence chain. Elena's mouth fell open. The entire chain? There must be 20 restaurants. 23, actually, Thomas corrected. Soon to be 24 with the new location in Seattle. A waiter approached with the first course. Tiny cups of soup garnished with what looked like edible flowers. He placed them carefully in front of Thomas and Elena, then backed away with a small bow. Elena waited until they were alone again, before leaning forward. That's insane, Thomas. You can't just buy a restaurant chain because one location was rude to me. Why not? Thomas asked, his expression genuinely puzzled. It's a solid investment. The restaurant industry in this area is growing and luminescence has a good reputation overall. But that's not why you did it, Elena pressed. Thomas set down his spoon and looked directly into her eyes. No, it's not. I did it because I saw an opportunity to make things right. Not just for you, but for anyone else who might have been treated the way you were. Elena shook her head, torn between exasperation and a reluctant sense of awe. In 15 years of marriage, she had seen Thomas build his company from a startup in their garage to a global technology leader. She knew he was smart, determined, and occasionally ruthless in business, but she had never seen him use his power quite like this. So what happens now? She asked. Now we enjoy our dinner, Thomas said, picking up his spoon again. And tomorrow we start implementing some changes. As they ate their way through course after course of exquisitely prepared food, Elena noticed something curious. The other diners were watching them, not openly staring but stealing glances, whispering to each other. A woman at a nearby table kept looking at Thomas with narrowed eyes, as if trying to place him. People are staring, Elena murmured over her dessert, a delicate chocolate creation that seemed to defy gravity. People always stare at what they don't understand, Thomas replied calmly. They're trying to figure out why we're getting special treatment when we don't look the part. And when they find out, Thomas smiled. That's the interesting part, isn't it? When people realize they've been judging books by their covers all along. As if on cue, a man approached their table. He wore an expensive suit and carried himself with the confidence of someone used to being recognized. Elena had seen him earlier, dining with a group at one of the large tables by the window. Excuse me, the man said, addressing Thomas. I hope I'm not interrupting. Not at all, Thomas replied politely. The man stuck out his hand. Ben Phillips, I'm with Horizon Ventures. Thomas shook the offered hand. Thomas Whitmore. This is my wife, Elena. Recognition flashed in Ben's eyes. Whitmore? The Thomas Whitmore? Of Secure Guard Technologies? Thomas nodded modestly. That's me. Ben let out a low whistle. Wow. I've been following your work for years. Your blockchain security protocols are revolutionary. Thank you, Thomas said. We have a good team. Ben glanced between Thomas and Elena, clearly trying to process the disconnect between Thomas's reputation and his unassuming appearance. I apologize for bothering you during your meal. It's just, we heard a rumor that you just acquired luminescence. The whole chain. Thomas took a sip of water. News travels fast. Then it's true? Ben looked almost giddy. The guy who revolutionized data security is now in the restaurant business? I prefer to think of it as the hospitality business, Thomas corrected gently. And yes, as of this morning, I'm the primary stakeholder. Ben shook his head in amazement. Incredible. Well, I won't take any more of your time. It's an honor to meet you, Mr. Whitmore. He nodded respectfully toward Elena. Mrs. Whitmore. As Ben walked back to his table, Elena could see him excitedly telling his companions what he had learned. Within minutes, the whispers had spread throughout the restaurant like wildfire. Faces turned toward them, expressions ranging from shock to admiration. And there it goes, Thomas said with a small smile. The manager materialized at their table looking even more nervous than before. Mr. Whitmore, Mrs. Whitmore, I hope everything was to your satisfaction. The food was excellent, Thomas acknowledged. Though I notice you seem to have changed your policy on wait times since yesterday. The manager's face flushed deep red. Sir, if I had known… Thomas held up a hand, cutting him off. That's precisely the problem, isn't it? You shouldn't need to know who someone is to treat them with basic courtesy. Of course, sir. I completely agree, the manager stammered. We strive to… I'd like to speak with you and your staff tomorrow. Morning, Thomas interrupted calmly. 9 o'clock. We have some new policies to discuss. The manager swallowed hard. Yes, sir. 9 o'clock. We'll all be here. After paying the bill, leaving a generous tip despite the service being borderline obsequious, Thomas and Elena walked out of Luminescence. The cool evening air felt refreshing after the tense atmosphere inside. You enjoyed that, Elena accused as they walked toward their car, though there was no real anger in her voice. Thomas chuckled. I enjoyed the look on that manager's face. When he realized who he'd been rude to, yes. Is that petty of me? Extremely, Elena confirmed, slipping her hand into his. But I can't say he didn't deserve it. They reached the car and Thomas opened Elena's door for her, a gesture he'd maintained throughout their marriage. The thing is, Elena said as she settled into her seat, I'm not sure this solves the real problem. Thomas got in beside her. What do you mean? They're being nice to us now because they know you're rich and powerful, Elena pointed out. But what about the next person who walks in wearing clothes from a department store instead of a designer boutique? What about the single mom who saved up for months to eat at a fancy restaurant for her birthday? Thomas turned to her, his expression softening. That's why we're having the meeting tomorrow. This isn't just about making them grovel to us, Elena. It's about changing how they do business. You really think you can change their whole attitude? Elena asked skeptically. Thomas started the car, his profile thoughtful in the dim light of the parking lot. I don't know if I can change their attitudes, but I can certainly change their behavior. And sometimes, when people are required to behave better, they eventually start to think better too. As they drove home, Elena gazed out the window, thinking about what had happened. Part of her still couldn't believe Thomas had bought an entire restaurant chain just because one location had mistreated her. It seemed like such an extreme response. But another part of her, the part that had stood in that restaurant feeling invisible and worthless, felt a warm glow of vindication. Not because the staff were now falling over themselves to please her, but because Thomas had seen an injustice and used his power to address it. Not just for her, but potentially for everyone who might walk through those doors in the future. What exactly are you planning to say at this meeting tomorrow? Elena asked as they pulled into their driveway. Thomas turned off the engine and sat back in his seat. I'm not entirely sure yet, but I was hoping you might come with me. Me? Elena looked surprised. Why? Because this started with you, Thomas said simply. And I think it should end with you too. Elena considered this for a long moment. I'll need to call a substitute for my class. I can do that for you first thing in the morning, Thomas offered. Elena nodded slowly. All right, I'll come, but only if you promise one thing. What's that? This isn't about revenge, Elena said firmly. It's about making things better. Thomas reached across the console to take her hand. I promise. This isn't about punishing them for what they did to you. It's about making sure they never do it to anyone else. And as they walked hand in hand into their modest home, Elena couldn't help but feel that tomorrow might bring something even more satisfying than revenge. It might bring real change. The next morning, Elena stood in front of her closet, considering what to wear to the meeting at Luminescence. After a moment's hesitation, she reached for the same navy blue dress she had worn when she was turned away. There was something fitting about facing them in the same outfit. Thomas was already dressed, in his usual style, neat but unremarkable clothing that gave no hint of his wealth or influence. He looked up from his coffee when Elena entered the kitchen. You're wearing the same dress, he observed. Elena nodded, pouring herself a cup of coffee. Seemed appropriate. It does, Thomas agreed with a small smile. They arrived at Luminescence, precisely at 9. The restaurant looked different in the morning light, less mysterious, more ordinary. The elegant furniture that had seemed so imposing at night now just looked like tables and chairs. The staff was waiting for them, assembled in a nervous cluster near the bar. The manager stood at the front, dressed in a suit that looked like it had been freshly pressed for the occasion. Beside him was James the maitre d', looking distinctly uncomfortable. Behind them were about a dozen other staff members, servers, bartenders, kitchen staff in their whites. "Good morning," Thomas said pleasantly as they entered. "Thank you all for coming." "Of course, Mr. Whitmore," the manager said quickly. "We're all very excited about the new direction for luminescence." Thomas gestured to the tables. "Why don't we all sit down? This won't take long." The staff exchanged glances, then awkwardly arranged themselves around the largest table. Thomas and Elena sat across from them. "First," Thomas began, "I want to introduce myself properly. I'm Thomas Whitmore, and this is my wife, Elena Rodriguez Whitmore." Elena noticed a few staff members shift uncomfortably at the mention of her Hispanic last name. "Some of you may know of me from my company, Secure Guard Technologies," Thomas continued. "But that's not why I'm here today." He looked around the table, making eye contact with each person. "I'm here because 2 nights ago, my wife came to this restaurant alone. She had a reservation. She was dressed appropriately, she was polite, and yet, she was made to wait for over an hour while other customers were seated ahead of her." The manager's face flushed red. "Mr. Whitmore, I want to assure you that this was a terrible misunderstanding." "Let me finish," Thomas said quietly. There was no anger in his voice, but the authority was unmistakable. The manager fell silent immediately. "When my wife asked about her table, she was told, and I quote, that she might be more comfortable at one of the casual dining establishments down the street." Several staff members looked down at the table, unable to meet his gaze. "Now I'd like to ask you all a question," Thomas said, leaning forward, "and I want honest answers. Why was my wife treated this way?" Silence fell over the table. The staff exchanged uncomfortable glances, but no one spoke. "No one," Thomas prompted. "Let me guess then. Was it because she came alone, because she wasn't wearing designer clothes, because her last name is Rodriguez? Or maybe it was some combination of these things?" A young woman at the end of the table, one of the servers, hesitantly raised her hand. "Sir, if I might say something?" Thomas nodded encouragingly. "Please do." It's not just what you mentioned," she said nervously. "It's the way we're trained here. We're told to prioritize certain types of customers." "What types?" Elena asked, speaking for the first time. The server glanced at the manager, who looked like he wanted to disappear. "People who look like big spenders. People who might order expensive bottles of wine or the priciest items on the menu. People who seem like they belong in a place like this." "And who determines what that looks like?" Thomas asked. "It's unofficial policy," another server added, gaining courage from his colleague's honesty. "The management never writes it down, but we all know. Certain types of customers get the best tables, the fastest service. Others, well, they might get seated by the kitchen or told there's an unexpected wait." The manager stood up abruptly. "This is completely inappropriate. These staff members don't speak for the restaurant." "Actually," Thomas said calmly, "as of yesterday, I believe they do. You see, I didn't buy this restaurant chain on a whim. I did it because what happened to my wife is wrong, and I suspect it's been happening to many other people." He turned to the staff. "How many of you have witnessed customers being treated differently based on how they look or how much money they seem to have?" Slowly, every hand at the table went up, including, reluctantly, the managers. "That's what I thought," Thomas said. "Well, as of today, that policy, written or unwritten, is over." He pulled a folder from his briefcase and opened it on the table. "These are the new service guidelines for all luminescence locations. They will be implemented immediately, and they will be enforced." The manager reached for the folder. "Mr. Whitmore, I assure you that I can handle—" "Actually," Thomas interrupted, "you won't be handling anything. As of today, you are being reassigned to our new training program. You'll be working with a consultant to develop and implement." Customer service protocols that focus on equal treatment for all guests. The manager's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. Are you firing me? No, Thomas said. I'm giving you an opportunity to be part of the solution. Whether you take it is up to you. He turned to James, the maître d'. The same goes for you. You can either help us build something better or you can find another job. Your choice. James looked down at his hands, then back up at Thomas. I'd like to stay, sir. And, I'd like to apologize to Mrs. Whitmore. He turned to Elena. What happened the other night was wrong. I knew it was wrong when I was doing it, but it was how things were done here. That's not an excuse, just the truth. Elena studied his face, seeing genuine regret there. Thank you for your honesty, she said quietly. Thomas handed copies of the new guidelines to each staff member. Take a few minutes to read through these, then I want to hear your thoughts. The room fell silent as everyone read. Elena looked over Thomas's shoulder at his copy. The document outlined clear, fair policies for seating guests, handling reservations, and providing service. It explicitly prohibited discrimination based on appearance, race, gender, or perceived wealth. It also introduced a new mystery diner program to ensure compliance at all locations. This is really good, one of the bartenders said after a few minutes. Actually, it would make our jobs easier to have clear rules that apply to everyone. Several staff members nodded in agreement. I have a question, a server said, raising her hand. What about dress codes? A lot of fine dining restaurants have them. A reasonable dress code is fine, Thomas replied, but it needs to be clearly communicated in advance and applied equally to everyone. No selective enforcement. The discussion continued for nearly an hour, with staff members asking questions and offering suggestions. Elena watched with growing amazement as the group transformed from a nervous, defensive cluster into an engaged team. Thomas listened to every comment, occasionally making notes or adjustments to the guidelines. There's one more thing, Thomas said, as the meeting drew to a close. I'd like to introduce the new general manager for this location. All eyes turned to the door as a woman entered. She was in her 50s, with salt and pepper hair pulled back in a neat bun. She wore a simple but elegant pantsuit and carried herself with quiet confidence. This is Lucia Vega, Thomas said. She has 20 years of experience in fine dining, most recently as the GM of Blue Water in Chicago. Lucia smiled warmly at the staff. I'm looking forward to working with all of you. Mr. Whitmore has shared his vision for luminescence with me, and I'm excited to help make it a reality. A restaurant where excellent food and service are available to everyone, without prejudice or pretense. The staff applauded politely, though Elena could see uncertainty on some faces. Change was never easy, especially when it challenged long-established habits. As the meeting broke up, Thomas pulled Elena aside. What do you think? I think you just did something remarkable, Elena admitted. When you first told me you bought the restaurant chain, I thought it was excessive. But seeing how you're using that power, it's impressive. Thomas smiled, looking slightly embarrassed by the praise. I had a good teacher. You've spent your whole career creating classrooms, where every child is valued regardless of where they come from. I'm just applying that principle to a different setting. Lucia approached them, extending her hand to Elena. Mrs. Whitmore, it's a pleasure to meet you. Your husband has told me what happened, and I want to personally assure you that nothing like that will happen again at any luminescence location while I'm involved. Thank you, Elena said, shaking her hand. But please, call me Elena. There's something else I wanted to discuss with you both, Lucia continued. Thomas mentioned you're a kindergarten teacher? Elena nodded, wondering where this was going. I've been thinking about ways we could connect with the community, Lucia explained. What would you think about a program where school classes could visit the restaurant during off hours? We could teach them about different foods, let them see a professional kitchen, maybe even let them make a simple dish. Elena's eyes lit up. My students would love that. Most of them have never been to a restaurant like this. And they deserve to feel welcome in these spaces too, Lucia said with a smile. Perhaps you could help us develop the program? We'd pay you for your time. Of course. Elena glanced at Thomas, who looked as surprised as she was. I'd be happy to help, she said. But no payment is necessary. Consider it my contribution to the change. As they left Luminescence, walking hand in hand into the bright morning, Elena felt a lightness she hadn't expected. What had started as an evening of humiliation was transforming into something positive, not just for her but potentially for many others. You know, she said thoughtfully, when I first told you what happened, I just wanted to forget about it and move on. But now I'm glad I didn't. Thomas squeezed her hand. Sometimes the things that hurt us can lead to the greatest changes, if we're brave enough to confront them. Elena smiled up at him. And sometimes it helps to have a billionaire husband to back you up. Thomas laughed, the sound echoing in the quiet street. That part was just luck. The real change is happening because people like Lucia and that young server were willing to speak up. Money can open doors, but it's people who walk through them and make things different. As they reached their car, Elena looked back at the restaurant. Through the window, she could see Lucia already deep in conversation with the staff, gesturing energetically. Something was happening there. Something that went beyond revenge or vindication. Something that felt like hope. 3 months passed quickly. Summer faded into early fall, bringing cooler temperatures and the start of a new school year. Elena's kindergarten classroom was once again filled with excited 5-year-olds learning their letters and numbers. The incident at Luminescence had begun to feel like a distant memory until the day Elena received an email from Lucia Vega. We're ready, it read. The program we discussed is finally set to launch. Would your class like to be our first visitors? Elena smiled, remembering their conversation. After the meeting at Luminescence, Lucia had indeed moved forward with the idea of opening the restaurant to school groups. Elena had helped develop the program during her summer break, suggesting age-appropriate activities and ways to make fine dining less intimidating for children who had never experienced it. What do you think? She asked Thomas that evening, showing him the email on her phone. Should I take my class? Thomas looked up from his laptop. Absolutely. I'd love to hear how it's going over there anyway. I've been so busy with work that I haven't checked in personally. You haven't been micromanaging? Elena teased. I'm shocked. I hired Lucia to do a job, Thomas replied with a smile. She doesn't need me looking over her shoulder. The following Tuesday, Elena led her wide-eyed kindergartners through the Aseoan front doors of Luminescence. The restaurant looked completely different in daylight, with sunlight streaming through the large windows. The tables had been rearranged, with several pushed together and covered with plastic tablecloths. Lucia greeted them at the door, her face lighting up at the sight of 20 excited children. Welcome to Luminescence, everyone. We're so happy. You're here today. A young man stood beside her, dressed in chef's whites. This is Chef David, Lucia introduced him. He's going to show you around the kitchen and help you make something special. The children gasped with excitement as Chef David led them through the swinging doors into the gleaming professional kitchen. Elena followed, watching as her students marveled at the giant mixers and shiny metal countertops. Today, Chef David announced, we're going to make pasta from scratch. What followed was an hour of flour-covered fun as the children learned to mix, knead, and roll simple dough. The kitchen staff helped each child create their own small batch of pasta, treating the uneven, oddly shaped creations as if they were culinary masterpieces. While the pasta cooked, Lucia gave the children a tour of the restaurant, explaining everything from the proper way to set a table to why some of the chairs face the windows. It's all about making people feel special, she explained, kneeling down to be at eye level with the children. Everyone deserves to feel special when they come to a restaurant, no matter who they are or what they're wearing. Elena caught her eye across the room and smiled, recognizing the new philosophy that had been implemented. When they returned to the kitchen, the staff had prepared the children's pasta with a simple butter sauce. The kids were seated at the tables. They had passed on their way in, now set with real, though child-friendly plates and silverware. "This is fancy eating," one little boy whispered loudly to his neighbor. "Remember what we practiced at school?" Elena reminded them. "Napkin in your lap, small bites, and what do we say to the chefs? Thank you for cooking for us." "The children," chorused. As the children enjoyed their meal, Elena noticed James, the former maitre d', helping a little girl who was struggling with her fork. His manner was patient and kind, a far cry from the dismissive attitude he'd shown on that fateful Aiswao night. Lucia slid into the chair beside Elena. "What do you think?" "It's wonderful," Elena said sincerely. "The children are having the time of their lives." Lucia nodded, watching the room with satisfaction. "We've done 3 of these sessions so far with different age groups. The middle schoolers were particularly interested in the business side of running a restaurant." "How are things going otherwise?" Elena asked. "With the changes?" "Better than I expected," Lucia admitted. "We lost a few regular customers who preferred the old way of doing things, the ones who liked feeling exclusive and special at others' expense. But we've gained many more new ones." She gestured toward a wall near the entrance that Elena hadn't noticed before. It was covered with framed photographs, staff members with customers, special events, community gatherings. "We've started focusing on creating experiences, not just serving food," Lucia explained. "Our revenue is actually up 15% from this time last year." Elena raised her eyebrows. "Thomas will be pleased to hear that." "He knows," Lucia said with a smile. "We've implemented the new policies at all 23 locations, 24 now, with Seattle. Not without some resistance, but the numbers speak for themselves. Turns out treating people well is actually good for business." After the meal, Chef David presented each child with a certificate, making them an official Luminescence junior chef. The children beamed with pride as their classmates applauded each presentation. As they were preparing to leave, James approached Elena hesitantly. "Mrs. Whitmore, could I speak with you for a moment?" Elena nodded, curious. "I wanted to apologize again properly," he said, looking genuinely contrite. "What happened that night? It wasn't right. I knew it wasn't right when I was doing it, but it was how things had always been done here." He glanced around at the children gathering their belongings. "Working with these school groups has been eye-opening. Some of these kids have never been to a restaurant nicer than a fast food place. But they light up when they're treated with respect, when they feel like they belong here. That's all any of us want," Elena said gently. "To feel like we belong." James nodded. "I'm grateful for the second chance. A lot of places would have just fired me and moved on." "Sometimes it's harder to change than to start over," Elena observed. "You're doing the harder thing." As Elena herded her students onto the school bus, Lucia handed her an envelope. "What's this?" Elena asked. "Open it later," Lucia suggested with a mysterious smile. That evening, Elena remembered the envelope. Inside was an invitation to a special event at Luminescence the following month, a celebration of the restaurant's community-first rebranding and the launch of a new scholarship program for culinary students from underserved areas. "Look at this," Elena said, showing Thomas. "They're using part of the profits to fund cooking school scholarships." Thomas read the invitation with interest. "Lucia has taken this further than I expected. This is impressive." "Would you like to go?" Elena asked. "To the event?" Thomas considered for a moment. "Actually, I think I'd rather not. This has become Lucia's project, and the staff's. They've taken ownership of it. I don't want to show up like some corporate overlord taking credit." Elena smiled at her husband's thoughtfulness. "I'm proud of you, you know. You could have just gotten revenge, made them grovel, and moved on. Instead, you created actual change." Thomas shrugged, looking slightly embarrassed. "I just provided the opportunity. They did the hard work." "Still," Elena insisted, "not many people in your position would have handled it that way." 6 months later, Elena found herself back at Luminescence for a different reason. Thomas was taking her to dinner for their anniversary. When they arrived, the restaurant was bustling with a diverse crowd. Young couples on dates, families celebrating special occasions. Business people having dinner meetings. James greeted them at the door with a genuine smile. "Mr. and Mrs. Whitmore, it's wonderful to see you again. Your table is ready." As they followed him to their seats, Elena noticed something remarkable. The clientele was noticeably different from that first night. Yes, there were still people in expensive clothes carrying designer bags, but there were also young couples, clearly on special occasion dates, elderly people celebrating anniversaries, and families with well-behaved children experiencing fine dining for the first time. More importantly, all of them were being treated with the same attentive service and respect. "What do you think?" Thomas asked once they were seated, gesturing around them. Elena took in the scene with satisfaction. "I think it's working, really working." Their server approached. A young woman Elena recognized from the initial meeting months ago. "Good evening," she said warmly. "It's wonderful to see you both again. We have something special prepared for your anniversary with Chef David's compliments." As they enjoyed their meal, Elena noticed a family at a nearby table, parents with 3 children, dressed in their best clothes, which weren't fancy, but were neat and clean. The parents looked nervous, glancing at the multiple forks with uncertainty. One of the children accidentally dropped a napkin. Immediately, a server was there, not with irritation or condescension, but with a friendly smile, a new napkin, and a quick, discreet demonstration of how to use the different utensils. The family, visibly relaxed, their experience saved by simple kindness. "That would have gone very differently before," Elena observed quietly. Thomas nodded, following her gaze. "That's the real victory. Not that they were nice to you once they knew who I was, but that they're nice to everyone now, regardless of who they are." After dessert, a special creation Chef David had prepared to commemorate their anniversary, Lucia stopped by their table. "I hope everything was to your satisfaction," she said. "It was perfect," Elena assured her. "And not just the food. The whole atmosphere has changed." Lucia smiled. "We've worked hard on that. The funny thing is, our regulars who stuck with us through the changes now tell us they prefer it this way. Turns out, most people don't actually want to be in an environment that makes others feel unwelcome. They just want good food and good service." "And the community programs?" Thomas asked. "Expanding to all locations," Lucia reported proudly. "The school visits, the scholarship program, even a new apprenticeship for adults looking to change careers. We're making fine dining more accessible on multiple fronts." As they left the restaurant, Thomas took Elena's hand. "You know what still amazes me? All of this happened because you were brave enough to tell me about being mistreated instead of just hiding it away." Elena squeezed his hand. "And because you were wise enough to see that real change is better than revenge." They paused, on the sidewalk, looking back at the warm, welcoming glow of luminescence. Through the windows, they could see people of all kinds enjoying one of life's simple pleasures, a good meal in a place where they felt valued. "I'd say that's worth more than a moment of getting even," Elena said softly. Thomas nodded, pulling her close. "Much more. That's the thing about real change. It keeps giving long after revenge would have faded away." And as they walked away hand in hand, the story of the simple woman denied service at a restaurant, and what her billionaire husband did next, continued to unfold behind them, not as a tale of wealth and power, but as a reminder that sometimes the most powerful changes begin with the smallest moments of injustice and the courage to speak up about them.